The Malazan engineers are a unique breed. Cantankerous, foul-mouthed, derisive of authority, secretive, and thick-headed. They're the heartstone of the Malazan army.
What up, and welcome back to another Malazan Book of the Fallen video. This time we're getting back into Deadhouse Gates. We're doing chapters 9 and 10. I think from here on out I'm going to try and do 2 chapters at a time, because that will mean that I get through the books twice as fast. They're going to be slightly longer, but just taking forever to get through the books, and so I was doing 3-4 chapters at a time in some of the Gardens of the Moon videos. I think 2 chapters will hopefully be that sweet spot. And these ones are real barn burners. We're closing out the second book of Deadhouse Gates. And so what we're going to do is, just as usual, we're going to go through the chapter analysis, reaction, summary, all of that stuff. And then second half, I'll let you know when to get out for the newbies so that we can get into all the spoilery goodness that happens during chapters 9 and 10. So we kick off with Kalam. He's basically traveling from Raraku across 7 cities, and he's encountering all these Malazan dead bodies, basically, that have been killed during this kind of whirlwind uprising. He has this weird sneaking suspicion that somebody's on his trail.
What? Who's there? What's going on?
And he stumbles onto this group of soldiers who are like purporting to be soldiers of the whirlwind, but they're really just kind of like opportunist renegades who are taking advantage of all the shenanigans that are going on and chaos associated with the whirlwind. They tell him that Camus Relo has basically taken back Hisar, and that Aaron has the Gistal within.
Wow, what does that mean?
And then they basically, like in a weird, affable kind of way, with all this chatter and stuff, they essentially threaten him a bunch of times, but he isn't really having it. They say that they're going to basically go and clean up the rest of these refugees, these Malazan refugees who are essentially like fleeing across the desert. Kalam goes with them under the auspices of helping them basically to loot and raid this Malazan party. And they're talking about like waging a holy war, and Kalam's like, dude, is it really holy to be like raping and pillaging these women? And the guy's like, well, it's not really holy, but it's just. They roll up on this camp of Malazan refugees, though, and Kalam's like, man, they have a soldier with them. What's this idiot doing? You shouldn't just be having a blazing fire. The dude is like still talking trash, the leader of this renegade band, and Kalam just straight up leans over and just slices the dude's throat open. And then all the other renegades kind of like pour into the camp, and it turns out it was a decoy all along, and this soldier guy knew what he was doing, and Kalam basically fights them all off and kills a bunch of them. There's 2 left, and then all of a sudden this horse comes rolling in with no rider, he thinks, and then all of a sudden this chick who's like hanging down off the side jumps up on top of the horse, butcher knifes this dude in the throat.
Damn, girl. You a badass.
And we come to find out that these are basically like the survivors of Korbal, which is like a Malazan outpost, and they have been attacked basically by the 7 cities' native armies, and they're like the only ones left. They've heard of the bridge burners, they've heard of Kalam. They're either like super scared or super impressed, but they get the notoriety associated with his name. And there's obviously been some pretty bad trauma, because the captain has obviously undergone like a critical head wound and is all super jacked up and has like lucid moments before he then like passes back out, and just, you know, for all intents and purposes, the 2 women are kind of running the show. The badass butcher knife chick is a widow, and there seems to be something going on there. But then they have to basically go and clean up the rest of the renegades. There was like 1 guy left to guard all the supplies, and Kalam's like, we got to go get that back. Turns out a bunch of, you know, actual whirlwind troops have showed up, and so it basically comes down to Kalam and Apt to swoop in and basically clean up 8 dudes at once.
Yes!
That's awesome.
Minala is like super impressed, but also kind of like freaked out because she sees all the Apps handiwork and there's like huge chunks of bodies missing and stuff like that. Kalam's like, yeah, I just got a little hungry. Yeah, just a savage, epic ass beating that they dished out to the whirlwind. But when Keneb wakes up, we, kind of get Kalam filled in on everything that's been happening in 7 cities, right? That Camus Relo is just one of the generals out there, and that actually Corbolo Dom, who used to be a fist in the Empire, is now turned renegade. And basically he's in charge of all of Sheikh's forces that aren't located in Raraku. And actually that's who ended up also being the ones who ambushed Keneb and his whole company, right? And so he rolled up as a fist of the Malazan army and pretended that everybody was homies, and then like proceeded to wipe out the entire Malazan force that was there, with only Keneb, his wife and kids and sister-in-law surviving the whole thing.
Really, bitch?
From there we jump over to the Happiness Cruise with Hiboric and Felison and Culp and company, all of that. They realize they're in this kind of flooded warren, that it used to be a plain, that they're not in an ocean. All of a sudden, all these Talon Imas kind of coalesce on the deck of Solanda. And they're basically looking for some of their homies, like a renegade bunch of Lorgos Talon Imas and the Tisti Dur, who we know are already dead in the captain's chambers. For some reason, they call Hiboric servant of the Chained One. The other thing they say is that, like, basically this crazy mage who's been like assailing them from the coast all the way through into this flooded warren needs to be taken out so that they can actually seal this warren, which we find out is actually Corald Emurlahn, which is kind of like that elder warren of the Tist Edur, these gray-skinned Tist who we found on the boat. And Culp's like, yeah, what? I've never heard of that before. And they're like all shocked because they're like, dude, you're a mage of Manas, right? And that is the Warren of Shadow, which is like the piece of Corald Emurlahn that humans can actually access. And therefore we find out that the Tisti Dur were also the rulers of Shadow before Shadow Throne and Cotillion actually ascended. And so ultimately they need to seal this wound in Corald Emurlahn, because if they don't, all the mages on board are basically going to go nuts. They need a soul to do it, to seal the hole. Gesler offers himself up to do it, and the Talon Imas is like, insufficient. Lagana Breed offers to do it because he's like the only one of the Talon Imas who are clanless, and so he basically has like nothing left to live for. He goes up to Stormy and offers him his sword as like safekeeping and as memory of his people, of his clan, which, of which he's the last and will be no more from here on out. And then, like, just for the greater good, he turns into like a cloud of dust and goes up into this wound and uses his soul to seal this tear in Corald Emurlahn. And yeah, it's pretty brutal. Stormy wants to know, like, did it hurt? And he really wants to know and pulls out the sword. The other Talon Imas comes up, grabs him by the throat, and they have like some silent words. And then we hear Stormy recount that basically, it hurts a lot and it's gonna hurt forever. And so like basically Lagana Breed is just in there, constantly suffering as payment for basically fixing this huge wound in the elder hold of Shadow. And like Stormy's crying and stuff, and it's just like a sad and beautiful moment because they recognize the bravery, the nobility, the selflessness, and it just brings these two like hard-ass grown men to their knees.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
And then we finally get back to the Duiker show in chapter 10, which is basically what the whole chapter consists of. Duiker's still on the trail of Coltaine at the beginning and trying to make his way back to the army. He can see that the army itself is desperately trying to reach this river. He can kind of pass unnoticed, or everybody thinks he's like this Seven Cities native, and so he's able to just like continue on his journey. And then eventually he comes to where these two armies are basically encamped and squared off against each other, and he has to like make his way through the Seven Cities, the Tithansi camps to make it to the Wiccan camps. And they just think he's this crazy old man who like wants to have one last hurrah and do a suicide mission into the Wiccan camps, and he uses that to his advantage and basically skirts in past the picket lines. The Wiccans realize who he is, or at least that, you know, he's not that crazy and that he must be a friendly, and let him through. It was pretty badass.
Like a ball. Oh yes, I keep the bank rolling.
He's received basically once he gets into the camp by Captain Lull, who we meet for the first time, I think, or maybe the second time. But Lull was actually the captain who was in Sialk, where Duiker and Culp and all of that stuff parted ways, and Duiker went back to Hisar to try and catch up with Coltaine. Lull was actually just in port at Sialk randomly for repairs when the whole mutiny and rebellion and all of that stuff that Stormy and Gessler saw in the bar that drove them out onto their ship and to boogie out with Culp and all of that. He took kind of command of all the remaining loyal forces there and led him on a mission to link back up with Coltaine. We find out that for whatever reason, the captain of the Sappers like doesn't show up to any of the command meetings. All they're doing is like repairing the wagons, collecting all these rocks, and everybody's just sitting around bitching about the Sappers. But the moral of the story is that they have to get these like the whole army and tens of thousands of refugees across this ford in the river, where they've got, you know, hostile forces on the other side of the river, and also basically they're boxed in on all sides on this side of the river and just being herded towards this one little ford. All the nobles roll up during this meeting too, and they're all super pissed because he's letting the wagons, the wounded, and the livestock go through first. And they're like, "What? That's you know, we should be the ones to get to go through first." And Coltaine's like,
I don't give up.
but yeah, then they also start bitching about like their rations and how you know, they can't eat, because Coltaine's like, yeah, if we don't get these livestock across them, what are we going to eat the whole rest of the time? And they're like, speaking of which, like, we don't like that our rations have been cut down and the soldiers haven't. And he's like, hey, if you want to start fighting, you get those full bellies too. And I thought that part was just like so savage and dope. You're just like, yeah, bro, do your part. But there is one noble, this Tumlet guy, who isn't totally terrible, but he's actually just super suspicious, right? Because he's like, what's going on with these Sappers? We didn't have all those wounded before that we'd be filling up all these wagons and all of this stuff, and just super suspicious. He's like, why are they bogged down so bad and riding so low? But all the captains are really worried, right, about this ford crossing. They have questions. Coltaine doesn't even bother to respond, and they all just kind of take it in stride and trust him and follow him and do what he's saying. We also find out a lot about what's been going on. Camus Relo apparently can't access his warrens because of all the stuff that was happening with the Path of Hands. And you remember when Sormo tried to do his little ritual and all the soul taken endeavors came out, or divers. That is more widespread now and happening to all the Warrens, and so that's really keeping Camus Relo at bay. And the only thing he has to fall back on is his like military prowess, of which he's just okay. He's not terrible, but he's definitely not great. He's overconfident. He thinks his numbers are going to show, and he's just basically being outclassed by Coltaine. We also get Duiker giving us some internal monologue where the Semp is now on the scene, and that's going to become a bigger part of the fray, right? Because we had the kind of tribal warriors, Camus Relo's army, and then now this other kind of tribal people show up on the scene as well. Duiker kind of makes peace with some of those Red Blades who were having that real dust up with the Wiccans when they first showed up in Hisar, and that was kind of cool to see, right? That they kind of have that this kind of strife and struggle in some ways has brought these disparate factions together as just one big fighting unit. Sormo Enath has raised the spirits of the land, which is like elder magic, and he's able to do that because these aren't like the warrens that typical humans use to access magic, and so he's not affected by all this stuff happening with Path of Hands and the Soul Taken and Divers, and this is like a huge part of their contingent that basically goes out and just jacks stuff up. But it's just a straight up heated battle, right? The first contingent that made it across is like scrapping with the army on the other side of the ford, and they're just being pressed on this side of the river from all sides, and it's just getting so intense. They're getting driven closer and closer to the river's edge, and Duiker's like, we're done. And List is like, bro, you're just as bad as Camus Relo, and totally clowns him for being so naive. We see Sormo's spirits are just out there straight up putting in work, right? And then we also see him like kind of relive a piece of their history at the end where they're being killed off by their own kind. They had this own kind of like internal civil war thing happening, and it's kind of a corollary, or it mimics what happened with the Wiccans. And they were having all these internal battles back and forth when Kalenved originally conquered the Wiccans, and he basically just told him and laughed at him and was like, dude, all I have to do is sit back and let you guys take each other out, and then eventually I'll be able to come in and kind of mop up and take over. And they realized that he was right, you know, that he had this wisdom to be able to see the long game, and that all of their petty infighting was, you know, so disadvantageous even to them that they, you know, ultimately respected him as somebody with that foresight and vision. And that was cool to see that backstory about how the Wiccans got pulled into the Malazan fold. And basically this is all being discovered as they're just basically squeezed to the very edge of the river, and Duiker's like, we're done, as soon as they hit the thing. But as soon as he steps in there, the river has now become a bridge.
Okay, what the hell?
And so he's like, finally, you know, sees what List was clowning him about, and realizes the genius of what Coltaine and the Sappers have done. What Tumlet, that noble who wasn't the terrible one, had kind of sussed out that the Sappers had been working this whole time, just gathering crushed rocks and all this stuff. And that was why the wagons had to go across first, was to dump all this rock and to turn this muddy, like 2.5 foot deep or 4 foot deep ford into basically a stone bridge that would enable them to move across in the tens of thousands with rapid speed and end up not getting killed. And then as soon as they're on the other side, all these sappers show up, and Duiker's like, what the heck's going on? And they straight up blow this bridge that they built sky high, 55 cussers, and just blew everything to hell. And that was just like so damn savage too, even though like at the end of the day, all the sappers are walking around crying because they just literally wiped out their entire stockpile of munitions. But in terms of epicness, it was pretty high up there. And that pretty much like solidified Coltaine's grip on this group of different factions, the Red Blades, you know, all the Wiccans, and then the Imperial army that he came to Hisar and took over. They had already started to build that camaraderie, but this really just kind of sealed it that they were 100% Coltaines now. And so they basically won a huge victory, but they've also, you know, still got tremendous challenge, because the place Ubard where they were going is now under the control of Camus Relo or Corbolo Dom, and so they have no choice but to basically go all the way to Aaron, which is just pretty much, you know, impossible. That, plus the fact that the Semp just seem kind of undefeatable. They go into that night after the battle. Sormo Enath and Nil take Duiker into what I think is Ontos Falak, basically into this warren. And that is where the Semp God is basically encased in ice from, you know, ages ago, some Jagat, you know, set in motion Ontos Falak, and this Semp God was trapped in the ice. And so they basically go there, unleash the spirits of the land to kill the Semp God, give these guys some peace, and also tie the spirits of the land tighter to the 7th Army so that they can use them going forward. Still, the threat of the Semp is very real. And then we kind of end with the nobles rolling up after all that stuff happens and complaining because now not only do they have their rations cut, but Coltaine has conscripted all of their servants, and they're like, who's gonna cook my food, who's gonna clean my clothes? Yeah, it was pretty dope. And so a lot of stuff happens, jam-packed with action, and the Coltaine stuff, that was, that river ford crossing was really intense reading, and I really enjoyed it. So, yeah, for those of you who are new to the series, now's your chance to jump out. Thank you so much for watching, but we're going to get into some spoilery stuff right here that you might want to earmuff it for. All right, and so there's a lot of cool spoilery stuff that happens this time that's just really cool to see. Meeting, Fist Keneb and Minala, both of which, are their, brother and sister-in-law ultimately, but it's easy to forget that once they diverge and go their separate ways, and she becomes Kalam's wife, and he's the Fist Keneb eventually, and yeah, just one of my favorite characters and his whole relationship with Grubb, and so it's just cool to finally see him get introduced into the mix. We also get a lot more of the backstory about all the Solanda stuff, right, in the Nascent, in the Shard of Emurlahn, with the renegade Imass, with the scrap, how between Karsa basically and the Tist Edur on there, what the Edur were in there doing, and all of that stuff, which is has a pretty long arc through all these coming books. And again, Deadhouse Gates, man, coming through. There's just so much crazy stuff that's in there. It's I know this sounds crazy, but it seems like one of my favorite books now just because of how consequential all this stuff actually is. And speaking of which, what about all that stuff with the Gistel, right? That stuff was planted way early on, enough to where even like these Tithansi tribesmen who Duiker's talking to are like, no, or actually it was the people Kalam was talking to, those like fake whirlwind renegade dudes who knew that the Gistel was an Aaron. And so this kind of betrayal was almost common knowledge, it seems like, and Malak Rel had been planning this for a long time, to the point where, again, everybody except for the Malazans knew about it. The other thing, and this isn't that spoilery, I guess, or maybe, yeah, I guess it is, but the Lagana breed stuff I just thought was like a really nice corollary to Heboric, right? Because Lagana breed was clanless. He didn't have a reason to live, at least not a reason for himself. That's very similar to Heboric, right? He was cast off by Fenner. He was excommunicated. And so, like, from his own standpoint, and same with Lagana breed, right? There is no meaning to life if you don't have people, you don't have your clan or whatever. But that's only true if you think about it in the context of, like, usefulness for yourself or for your own motives and desires. And I think one of the cool mirrors to what Heboric does is that you can still use your life, even if it doesn't have meaning for you, to create meaning for other people. And Lagana obviously goes up and seals that warren, but then, Heboric basically does a very similar thing in the context of the Crippled God, right? And uses that to benefit all of humanity or the whole world, really. And also the kind of compassionate piece with Korabas. I know I'm terrible at pronouncing that, but yeah, I just thought that was like a really cool foreshadowing that I never picked up on before, and kind of mirrors what's going to ultimately end up happening with Heboric. Last thing I will say is that we get to meet Captain Lull and Corporal List, who are just straight up some of my favorite characters from the book. And for everybody who says Erikson doesn't do good on character stuff, I feel like they're very fleshed out, even though we don't get a ton of dialogue or even spend a ton of time with them. The time that you do get, these are pretty deep human beings, right? And so we don't get any of that in this chapter, but just seeing the evolution of Lull in particular, who becomes pretty philosophical and has some really deep commentary later in the books. And you really, at least I really got a sense of what that dude was all about. And so I loved seeing him get introduced into the mix too. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and leave it there. I hope you liked the video and the spoilery stuff. Let's chop it up in the comments or the Discord or what have you. You can become a member. You can hit up the Patreon. You can buy some merch. Any of that stuff goes. Not necessary at all. More than anything else, I just want to say, hope you're having fun. Thank you for watching, and happy reading.